Welcome back to this series, this Fast Learning for Leadership in Crisis series run under the ISRM. And in this session, we're going to look at a predictor of disaster, a signifier. As an organization has the vulnerabilities that will almost inevitably at some stage lead to failure. And if you are unlucky, when the cards fall against you, could lead to catastrophic impacts and consequences. Crises do not just happen. Nothing just happens. Everything is part of a causal chain. And it is a truism, not just of crisis management of the universe we live in, that the earlier we are aware of potential problems, then the easier it is to deal with it. We have a session on that called the 3 Golden Rules. And very briefly, the 3 Golden Rules are: 1, there is no such thing as a random problem. 2, the earlier you are aware of a potential problem, then you have more options to deal with it. You can deal with it with a lower level of energy, and you're in less danger, greater safety. And each time you don't deal with it or you ignore it, which is usually what happens, then you have less options to deal with it. You have to respond with a high level of energy, and you're in greater danger. And the 3rd rule is, we cannot control or influence the external environment. We can't influence satellite failure, IT failure, earthquake, terrorist attack. But what we are responsible for are the internal vulnerabilities that allow us to damage that. And that acceptance of that final rule, that we are responsible for our own vulnerabilities, brings the responsibility back into our own hands. And in this session, I want to go through the 6-fold pathway to disaster. It's not something I've made up, it's something that's well recognized within the literature, within the models and frameworks and methodologies. One of the sad things in general, but also in this particular time of COVID-19, is the seeming almost total lack of awareness of the work that has been done in academia around crisis management. There seems to be no, from my perspective, I can see no evidence that our leaders have an understanding of the challenges and critical failure points that are intrinsic and inherent to any crisis management program. And so what I'd like to do today in this session is to go through some things that are very simple, very, very simple, very basic, but also very powerful, that I hope will allow you to look inside your own organization and to think, well, what can we do maybe to influence our own capabilities in terms of identifying vulnerabilities and then maybe doing something about them. If I might say so, we are not operating in a vacuum. The standard textbooks of crisis management have been around since the 80s, and some of that since then. Rickle and Weber, whose paper on wicked problems I mentioned in the first opening introduction to this series, wrote their papers in 1973. That's almost exactly 50 years ago. But anybody who's done any basic academic research, and often just a general management understanding of these issues, would know, for example, Charles Perrow, 1984, Normal Accidents is a well-known management book. 1987, you have Turner and Pidgeon, Man-Made Disasters. 1997, sorry, that was 1994, 1997, Toft and Reynolds, Learning from Disasters. Standard textbooks. And what all of them have in common is a recognition and an understanding that what causes the crisis event or allows the triggering event to escalate into a crisis is not the external environment, but inbuilt vulnerabilities within our own systems. They are almost always systems failures. And they are failures of systems over which we have control. This is good. This is very good. Why? Because it allows us to do something about it. Barack Obama was an interesting leader. Whatever your politics is, it has nothing to do with politics. But as a leader, very, very interesting. One of the interesting things about his leadership was during the 8 years that he was in power, and of course, he came to power in 2008, just when the financial crash was happening and America was being dropped into it. The banks were going bust. The car industry was going bust. And during those 8 years, there was not a single scandal that came out of the White House. Not one. Nothing of any significance compared to all of the predecessors that had been before him. And even more impressive was that in the years since he left the White House, it has again been nobody's spilt the beans, nobody's written the books, nobody's done the dirty, which is, for anybody working within any organization, is almost unbelievable. And he's worthy of study as a leader, whatever your politics might be. But he said something very interesting. He said that in the culture of the White House, so what Obama said when he was hiring into the White House was he told the people coming in, the reason you're in this room is because you're the absolute best we could find. If we could find somebody better, we'd be talking to them. And if you come onto this team, it's because we think you've got something to bring. And therefore, what we want you to do is to take ownership of it. We're not going to tell you what to do. We're going to tell you what we want done. You're going to tell us this is how we do it. But the rules are, you don't get drunk with journalists and talk supposedly off the record and dish the dirt. You don't play around where you shouldn't be playing around. You don't try and fix your taxes for a couple of $1,000s when you're making really good money here, and you'll make good money for the rest of your life because you've been here. But above all, don't do stupid stuff. That's the rules. Don't do stupid stuff. And this is for grown-ups. If you can't live by those rules, tell us now, leave the room, because we haven't got time to muck around. And the fact that, for whatever reason, resulted in a White House of 8 years without a single scandal coming out of it. And loyalty to the boss until today, I think, is a lesson in leadership and organizational behavior, which has value. In much the same way, in terms of crisis management, the basic rule of crisis management is don't do stupid stuff. If you build houses on a floodplain, there's a clue in the name of a floodplain. Why is it called a floodplain? Because when the riverbanks go and the rains come, it floods. You can't then complain when nature does what it does. In much the same way, in almost all crisis events, when you look down into it, there have been failures of management, failures of leadership, technical failures, but above all and overarching everything, cultural failures that can be seen to be at the root of what has later become a crisis event. It is famous that culture beats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And if the culture is one of laziness, of lack of responsibility, of ignoring that which is clearly in front of you, then no strategy in the world will save you. But let's have a look at the pathway of disaster, because this will be a very clear and simple and succinct way of checking out your own organization and looking at it in terms of potential vulnerabilities. So I'm now going to tell you 6 things about your next crisis event. Think about it. Think about your crisis event. Every single one of you, I have, everybody I know has, you have, every organization has those things that you know, really needs to be fixed, really needs to be fixed. And yet, for some reason, it doesn't. And not only does it not get fixed, it becomes normalized. What can be called normalization of deviation. In that the fact that people are late all the time becomes normal. The fact that there's a high level of turnover of management, which is a signifier of something not being good, becomes normal. Failures of systems become normal. And rather than fixing the underlying problems, we normalize deviation, we normalize that which we know to be wrong. I'm sure now, I'm prepared to bet right now, me and you, I'll bet $100 to $5, 20 to 1, that right now you are thinking of something that comes under that heading. It's not a matter of blame, but as of now, it's a matter of responsibility. Because once you know it, you can't pretend you don't know it. So let's have a look at the pathway to disaster. And I'm going to tell you 6 things about your organization. First thing is, whatever the problem you're thinking about is, the crisis, it's not an external event. It may be triggered by an external event, but the vulnerability is within your own organization. It is something that you actually have control of. Because you're aware of it and you're not putting in place the basic fundamental parts of crisis and risk management, security and risk management. It says risk control. You minimize the likelihood of something, an unwanted event happening, or you minimize the impact of an unwanted event that does happen. And there are unwanted events that you know are coming towards you and you have not put in place that which you should to mitigate the likelihood of it happening or to minimize the impact if it does happen. And so we can move on to the second step on the pathway to disaster, which is that because these are inbuilt vulnerabilities, these are systemic failure points, you have what Charles Perrow called normal accidents, 1984. And normal accidents is God's gift. It's God's gift to you to say, I'm giving you a chance, I'm giving you a warning, I'm letting you know, I'm telling you, how many chances do you want? And yet normal accidents themselves become normalized. And so become just part of the background noise that we all operate in. And so we come on to the third stage, which is when that normal accident, one day the gods just play dice with your life, and it's your turn, and you get unlucky for whatever reason. And that normal accident that is normalized and accepted and understood, something happens and it escalates it up into the next stage. Suddenly you have a situation. Many of you will know about the King's Cross fire, for example. This was a situation where, in those days, it was normal. There was wooden escalators, oil, grease, papers, tickets, newspapers, and people smoking cigarettes and lighting light. I mean, what could go wrong? What could possibly go wrong? And so there was an understanding that it was what smouldering fires all the time in King's Cross. And one day they got unlucky and it turned into the King's Cross fire. That's going to happen to any of us. And when that happens, there are time gaps. There are 3 time gaps. Because you think it is the same as before. Your cognition says this is the same as that. And you do not recognize that you've had a category jump. It's moved to something else. Just like it wasn't recognized that COVID-19 or coronavirus, as it was originally called, was not the same as the flu. People thought it's like the flu. That's what we look at. We recognize it as flu, and we're not seeing the category jump the minute it was something else. And when that happens, there are 3 consequences. The first consequence is that there is a time gap. There's 3 time gaps. The first time gap is between something triggering into a crisis scenario, crisis category, and you noticing it, your organization noticing it. So this is a matter of sensitivity. And most organizations consciously desensitize themselves to crisis events. So they don't, when something happens, they don't realize the implications. BP, Deepwater Horizon. A classic example of an organization which saw what was happening. They saw what was happening, but did not realize the implications of it because they thought it was the same as had happened multiple times before. So there's that first time gap of cognition. The second time gap is, and we can see this clearly in the COVID-19 development at the government level, is once there is a recognition that something needs to be done, the question is, well, what is that? And because there's no clear guideline, it's not just process management, this is what we do, but it's, does anybody have any ideas? I mean, does anybody have a clue what is happening here? What does that mean? What are the options? And if those options, what are the consequences of those options? And so it takes time to make decisions. During which, of course, the crisis is not standing still. The crisis itself has its own existence and it's escalating and it's mutating and it's developing. And so when you finally do turn over your shoulder and look at it, it's turned into another monster because it ain't hanging around for you, me, or anybody else. So that's the second time gap. First time gap is cognition. Second time gap is decision making. Third time gap is from the moment you make the decision to having impact. So you might make a decision, for example, to go into lockdown, or you might make a decision, for example, that we need more PPE, personal protective equipment. But how long does it take you to get that? I mean, if that's a 6-week timeline, then that's how long it takes. The fact that the UK government now, on the 21st of April, cannot provide frontline healthcare workers with the necessary personal protection equipment and have desensitized them, because now Public Health England's guidelines on what is acceptable for frontline care workers and frontline medical workers in the highest risk environments, they have downgraded what is considered as acceptable, not because that is a clinical decision, but because they don't have the equipment, and therefore they've downgraded what is acceptable, because that is what is available. In my opinion, from a crisis management perspective, 2 months into this thing is unforgivable. It's unforgivable. It is not sudden, it is not unexpected, it is not unpredictable. It is something that should be on the radar on the very, 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 very first meeting. It's what resources do we need and how are we going to get them? Because the idea that you can go out into the world and buy this stuff, the whole world is having exactly the same crisis. So why you expect that you can go out and buy some stuff like that? I don't know. So those are the 3 time gaps. First time gap is cognition. Second time gap is decision making. Third time gap is from decision making to impact. And of course, that's a powerful understanding, because you can actually impact that. You can't impact the last one, maybe, but you can certainly shorten the time gaps of cognition and decision making. And if you do, then that will have benefits, because it means that you will be dealing with the situation earlier in its development cycle. And based on the 3 golden rules, the earlier you can be aware of a potential problem, which is by doing these sorts of things, you have more options to deal with it. You can respond with a lesser degree of energy, and you're safer. So we now see the different parts of the models overlapping and creating real powerful shapes and frameworks and structures that can help us. So that is the first, to go back, the first step was the problem is inside your system. The second thing is you have normal accidents, which is God's gift and God's opportunity for you to do something about it. And the third thing is that when something does happen, when it triggers up into the next level or crisis category, you don't notice it, it takes time to make decisions, and then there's a long time to impact. The fourth thing is, when you do finally respond, you decide to move, and then we can see this in every situation, but particularly, for example, in COVID-19, you have a lack of 4 things. A, manpower. B, equipment. I can guarantee that you'll have a lack of manpower and equipment, because it's almost certain that if I was to ask you, do you have enough manpower and equipment to manage your normal operational activities, the answer would be no. We are overtasked, undermanned, and under-resourced. So if you don't have enough capacity and capability to manage normal operational status, as we do not in the UK, whether it's in health or energy or transport or logistics or food deliveries, for example, all of which are under pressure at the best of times. Then there is no surge capacity. There is no spare capacity which you can use to surge up to manage the extra challenges, the extra pressures on those systems through a crisis event. And the third thing missing is management skills, as we see in COVID-19. Because most people, very, very few people, have been taught how to do this stuff. They don't know how to do it. They don't understand it. It's not part of their normal job. The chairman of Kensington Chelsea Council, the day after the terrible tragedy that was Grenfell Towers, did not know how to look after 500 people at 5 o'clock in the morning in the richest borough in London. The fire was a fire, terrible thing. But at the end of the day, the council then had the responsibility to look after 500 people, or whatever it was, at 5 o'clock in the morning. Hopefully they had a plan for that. Somewhere that should have been on the risk register. And so you don't have enough management. And then, of course, you don't have enough budget. Now, the UK government and governments around the world have been putting incredible amount of money into this. It has to be paid back. It has to come from somewhere. How that will happen, I don't know. I don't know enough about economics. But the likelihood is that it will be those without who will have to pay most, as is usually the case. But it's not free money. It's not free money. And so you have lack of manpower, lack of resources, lack of management skills, lack of budget, because crises cost money. And then the fifth thing is, when you finally get all of these things together and you make your move, you've decided what to do, you make it, you've got it back, and you do your move, the crisis does not respond as it should do. It does not cooperate. And whatever you do does not solve a problem, but creates a new generation of problems. Lockdown has not solved COVID-19. It's pushed it down the road, which was what it was designed to do. It hasn't solved it. Because then you have all of the unintended consequences about the impact on social cohesion, on mental health and well-being, on domestic violence, on the education of our children, on the pressure that comes from people being without money and not knowing where it's going to come from. And then, of course, the problem is about releasing. How do you release? Technically speaking, locking down is not difficult. Technically speaking, the decision is difficult, but then technically it's not difficult to lock down country, town, city. It's been done. Releasing from a lockdown, that's difficult. That's challenging. And so you have unintended consequences. The law of, I didn't mean that. No, that's not what I meant. And yet, by doing your actions, that's what happens. And then you have a new generation. And finally, you're through it. Finally, you get through it. You get through it. So that's the fifth one. So what we have is what I'm saying about organizational vulnerability. The vulnerabilities are inbuilt. Secondly, you have normal accidents, which are signifiers of those vulnerabilities and an opportunity to do something about it, but they're ignored. Third, when something does happen, it triggers up into the next stage. You don't recognize that because you think it's a normal accident, and therefore you have those time gaps, the time gap of cognition, decision-making, and then impactful response. Then when you finally decide to move, you have a lack of manpower, resources, management skills, and budget. And when you do something about it, the crisis does not respond as planned, and you have a new generation of problems you then have to deal with. And finally, you've got through it. You've done it. Whatever it took, you did it. You got through. And what's the sixth thing we can predict? I will predict, and you can predict. I'm sure you recognize. Lessons are not learned. Lessons are not learned. Lessons are forgotten. And whatever were the underlying fundamental issues that allow those vulnerabilities to exist previously, come back. If we look at the underlying fundamental systemic weaknesses that allowed the 2008 global crisis to happen, global financial crisis to happen. Every single one of those things is back on steroids, more than. And it takes somebody who knows a lot more about it than I do to be able to explain that clearly, but it is nonetheless true. And so lessons are not learned. And there's what's called a reversion to mean. You go back to what you always do. There's another lesson, the seventh lesson, which is when you look back at it. It's not, oh my God, how did that happen? It's, what the hell did you think was going to happen, my friend? What did you think was going to happen if you allow this to happen? Boeing 737 MAX. You know these planes don't work. You know there's a fault. What the hell did you think was going to happen? You think that wasn't going to happen? Of course it's going to happen. The Volkswagen emissions. What do you think was going to happen? You thought nobody was going to find out? What the hell did you think was going to happen? That's the response. What the hell did you think was going to happen? And yet we play those games with systems whose failures have catastrophic impacts and consequences, generational. What we are going through, the children today, the children who are 7 years old and 5 years old and 9 years old and 13 years old, will be telling their grandchildren in 50, 60, 70 years' time about the spring of 2020 when I lived through COVID. This beautiful spring. The weather is beautiful. If you walk outside, the world looks a beautiful place, and yet. And so if there's anything that I would like to share with you, it is that actually we have things which we can take responsibility for. We can have a difference, we can have an impact, we can move the dial. It is in our power. Don't do stupid stuff. Do that which you know you should do. Accept responsibility for our own actions. These are coming back to Rick and Weber's 10th principle of wicked problems. The planner has no right to be wrong. I hope this has had value to you. I look forward to seeing you again. Meanwhile, I wish you, your people, your family, your organizations to be safe. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.